Okay, so now we're going to move into the book Asylums. And I'm going to take a little break here. I'll be back in a minute. Okay, so here we go. I have Irving Goffman's book, Asylums, that was published in 1961. Interesting quote here from him. Society is an insane asylum run by the inmates. That quote is relevant to the way he understood, I think, why people ended up in mental hospitals. So here we go. So first of all, this book is based on a participant observation study that he did within a mental hospital. He gets himself hired on to the staff of a mental hospital back in the early 1960s, and is looking at the mental hospital from the inside, and actually is going to look at it from the point of view of the patients. He's not going to look at it from the point of view of the doctors and the nurses. And this is unique, especially at this time. And he's going to ask a really important question. He's going to ask the question of how people end up in mental hospitals. Now, I don't know if anybody's ever seen it, but there was a novel. It's a work of fiction that came out around the same time by a guy named Ken Kesey, who wrote a book called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Made a really, really good movie about it. It's got Jack Nicholson in it. Now that you're all holed up, with the pandemic, with nothing to do except sociology, and you're looking for a good movie to watch, you may want to watch One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It is a fictionalized account of life in a mental hospital, but there are a lot of similarities between Irving Goffman's sociological study and Ken Kesey's fictional story about what happens in a mental hospital and what life for patients is like in a mental hospital. So again, now Goffman asked the question, well, how do people end up in mental hospitals? And the answer he gives to that is, if you were to ask a psychiatrist back in 1961, why do people end up in mental hospitals? Well, the answer they would give you is because they're ill, they're mentally ill. And you go, just like you go to the hospital when you are medically ill, you go to the mental hospital when you are mentally ill. And you go there to be cured. Now, Goffman looks at this a lot differently. Goffman's going to argue that, first of all, he's going to say that, not everybody outside the mental hospital is sane, and not everybody inside the mental hospital is insane. People end up in mental hospitals for a variety of reasons. And they all have to do with this. They all have to do with, as he says, people getting caught up in the heavy machinery of mental health bureaucracy, right? Mental health care bureaucracy. So how do they end up in mental hospitals? Well, sometimes they are referred to mental hospitals by courts of law, right? The judges sentence people to time in a mental hospital. In fact, I believe that the main character in Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest ends up in the mental hospital because he's referred to the hospital by a court of law. Another way that people end up in mental hospitals is that sometimes they get committed by family members. Family members they go through this legal process and they have people committed. And in other ways that people end up, sometimes they volunteer. They see themselves as having problems and they have themselves admitted. So for some reason, they end up in the mental hospital. Now, And it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with their actual symptoms. I guess that's the big point. Okay, now he also describes the mental hospital as a sensible social world. That's a really important idea. The mental hospital is a sensible social world. And what he meant by that was, again, if you were to talk to typical mainstream let's say psychiatrists at the time, they wouldn't have seen the mental hospital as a sensible social world. By sensible social world, Goffman meant that it is a world that operates according to norms, its own norms and its values, and where people in that world form relationships with each other, right? They form groups and they form relationships with each other. So he's calling life in a mental hospital a sensible social world. And we could say that about a lot of things. Right? Life at a university, right, is a sensible social world where, students, for example, they're not potatoes in a sack. They form relationships with each other, and that world operates according to its own values and its own norms. It's community, and Goffman is saying the same thing about a mental hospital. Okay, the patients, right, form relationships with each other. It's a sensible social world. It operates according to its own rules, its own values, its own norms. Psychiatrists maybe wouldn't have seen it that way. They would have said that, well, the people in the mental hospital are mentally ill, and because they are mentally ill, they are not capable, right, of forming genuine social relationships with each other. And Goffman is disagreeing with that the people do. Actually, within mental hospitals, they form cliques and friendships and groups of peers and so on. Okay. And that brings us to the next point, that mental patient is a social role. Mental patient is a social role into which people are socialized. Just like student is a social role into which people are socialized. You had that article by Gracie about kindergarten, right? Kindergarten is academic boot camp, where kindergarten is the place, right, where people begin to be socialized into the role of student. And you are, throughout your entire educational career, your entire schooling experience, you are socialized into the role of student. Excuse me. And the same thing with mental patients. People in mental hospitals learn this role of mental patient. They learn how to be a mental patient, just like you learn how to be a student. Just like those Marine Corps recruits learn how to be a Marine. Now he calls it the moral career of the mental patient. Now that phrase, moral career, simply means socialization. You could just substitute socialization for the word moral career. And that, he says, this moral career, the socialization process, right, operates independently of and regardless of the inmate's actual mental condition or mental state. It doesn't matter. They could be schizophrenic or whatever, right? Or, suffering from severe depression or whatever. But regardless of their mental condition or their mental state or their particular symptoms, this socialization process is going to operate on them, okay? And they're going to learn the role of mental patient, and they're going to learn what is the acceptable way, right, to play that role. And they're going to learn that role in the context of a total institution, right? Because the mental hospital is a total institution. So you know a little bit about total institutions now. We can maybe, you saw all that stuff about Marine Corps boot camp. That's an example of a total institution. Prisons are an example of a total institution. I gave you that article about Indian boarding schools from Mary Crow Dog, right? That's that boarding school was a total institution. And what you know, basically about a total institution is that, well, it's a situation where the institution, or the people that run the institution, are using the institution to exert total control, right? That's why it's called a total institution. They're trying to exert total control over a body of people, a population of people that Goffman calls inmates. They're trying to exert this total control over this group of inmates. Why? For whatever the purposes of the institution are. So in military boot camp, the purpose of the institution is to re-socialize people to become soldiers, right? In a prison, the goals of the institution are to punish, or to maybe to rehabilitate or something, but there's an institutional objective there, or maybe just to simply control. Same with the Indian boarding school. It has its purposes, and the institution is set up to achieve the goals of the institution, whatever they are. But the total institution has some other characteristics that we can talk about. We haven't talked about yet, and I wanted to talk about them. So I have old Irving Goffman here, and he's describing the total institution, and he says, first, all aspects of life are conducted in the same place and under the same single authority. So that's one of the characteristics of a total institution. Everybody is housed in this one place, and they're pretty much, maybe not completely, but as completely as possible, they are cut off from the rest of the world. Okay. Second, each phase of the member's daily activity is carried on in the immediate company of a large batch of others, all of whom are treated alike and required to do the same thing together. So there is no privacy, there is no autonomy, everything you do is controlled, right, by the institution. He says, third, all phases of the day's activities are tightly scheduled, with one activity leading at a prearranged time into the next, the whole sequence of activities being imposed from above by a system of explicit formal rulings, explicit rules, and a body of officials. Imposed from above, right? Activities imposed from above. So you're not doing what you want to do. You're doing what the institution wants you to do, okay? And then finally, he says, the various enforced activities are brought together into a single rational plan, purportedly designed to fulfill the official aims of the institution. So that single rational plan, right? The plan, right? The institution's plan for achieving whatever goal the institution has, whatever that might be. Fulfilling the official goals of the institution. And then he goes on to talk about how the total institution, since it's all regimented and there's all this routine that's imposed from above on the body of inmates, that the purpose behind it is to control. It's a system of control. Here's what he says. Okay. When persons are moved in blocks, they can be supervised by personnel whose chief activity is not guidance or periodic inspection, but rather surveillance, right? That's the main thing, surveillance. Seeing to it that everyone does what he has been clearly told is required of him under conditions where one person's infraction is likely to stand out in relief against the visible, constantly examined compliance of others. So the institution is making everybody conform. Everybody is conforming, regimented and conforming. And when somebody gets out of line, somebody deviates, that deviant stands out, and now you can crack down on it. Okay, so the total institution is a system of social control, right? And the rules of the institution are maintained. How are norms maintained? Well, the norms are maintained through sanctions, right? Norms are maintained through sanctions. So, in a mental hospital, what does that mean? Well, we also had, the idea of manifest and latent functions. And one of the things that Goffman talks about when he's describing how norms are enforced, how the rules of the institution are maintained, it's various things, including therapies, right? Including therapies that are really social control measures or ways of disciplining people in disguise. Okay, so punishments in the disguise of therapies in the mental hospital. So that might include, how do we keep everybody in line in a mental hospital? Well, here I'm going to read. Suspension of all privileges, psychological mistreatment, such as ridicule, vicious ribbing, moderate and sometimes severe corporal punishment, or the threat of such punishment, locking up the patient in an isolation room, denial or distortion of access to the professional personnel, threatening to putting the patient on the list for electroshock therapy, transfer of the patient to undesirable wards, and regular assignment of the patient to unpleasant tasks, such as cleaning up after the soilers. Okay. Now there's a whole list of different things that the institution can use to keep people in line. I wanted to focus on where he talks about electroshock therapy. So electroshock, I don't know if they don't use it as much as they used to. But again, if you ever saw One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Jack Nicholson's character gets out of line and they take him to the electroshock therapy room. So what does that mean? Well, in mental hospitals, they used electroshock therapy. It was believed to be therapeutic, right? That it was going to help cure you. It was going to kind of like reset your brain. Now, what they did was they would attach these electrodes to your head, and they'd get you to bite down on a big piece of rubber so you don't bite your tongue off. And then they would, shoot electricity through your brain, and that would send you into all these like really serious convulsions. It's a very, very painful, you can imagine, very painful and a very unpleasant thing to have to go through, right? And they had other things too. They had immersion therapy, right, where they would put you in a bath of ice water up to your neck, and leave you in there until you went into hypothermia. Or sometimes instead of electroshock therapy, they use something called insulin shock therapy, where they would give you an overdose of insulin and send you into insulin shock. And all these things were claimed to be therapeutic. And what Goffman was talking about is how the threat of them becomes, the negative sanction, right? That encourages conformity to the institution's rules. Okay, everybody good with that? You got that? Right? So the idea here is that the patient comes into this mental hospital, and what they learn kind of right away is that they don't really have control over themselves anymore. And if they're going to get over, if they're going to survive, they've got to learn, what the administration, what the doctors, for example, what the staff wants from them, and that's how they learn. That's what they learn about how to play the role of mental patient. It's almost like we could say they're playing the game, right, of being a mental patient. They're presenting this role. They're presenting the role of the good patient, right, to the doctors. Okay, and this all begins, through something called the degradation ceremony, and you learned about that already too. So, what is the degradation ceremony? Well, the degradation ceremony is, the initiation into the total institution. Um, um, it is usually part of an ordinary intake process. So, like if you were going into a prison, you would be perhaps you would be strip searched and you would be subjected to a full body cavity search, and your hair would be shaved off. You get your hair shaved off. You get a uniform. You get a number, and all of that has the other consequence of being humiliating. That degradation ceremonies are really like a kind of a ritual that's intended to humiliate people, to teach them a really important lesson really quick, and that is that they don't have control over themselves anymore. They don't belong to themselves anymore. They belong to the institution, and that the representatives of the institution can basically do whatever they want. So you had those Marine Corps recruits coming into Parris Island. What happened to them? They're hustled off the bus. They're standing there on line. They got drill sergeants like right up in their face, violating their personal space, yelling insults at them. They get their hair shaved off. It seems like hair is important. They get their hair shaved off. They get their uniform. They get humiliated. Okay. You have Mary Crow Dog talking about, the degradation ceremony in the Indian boarding school. Now, I was going to hand you that article out, but since we're all hunkered down here with the pandemic, I'm going to have to get you a link to that article so you can read it. But she talks about how these little girls, right, coming into this boarding school are stripped, haircut, bathed in alcohol, and that behind it is a humiliation that goes along with it. Okay, so the initiation of the inmate into that total institution always begins with this degradation ceremony. So where do we end? Well, again, we end with this idea that, well, the patients are going through the socialization process. They learn the role of patient. They learn the role of mental patient. And they play it, right? They play it for the hospital staff. They play it on the front stage for the hospital staff. But even in the context of the mental hospital, there's a back region. There's a backstage that they can step out of that role. Talks about, places like the game room and the day rooms and things like that, where the patients can leave that aside, for a little while. And if I could put it like this, they play the role of mental patient for the doctors on the front stage. And then they can step out of that role where they are with each other. And they become, I'm going to use this word, but I'm going to put it in air quotes, right? They become more normal. They can become themselves. They can become more like themselves, right? So front stage and backstage is really, really important idea in this whole book of the moral career of asylums. Okay. All right. So where are we going next? Yeah. Well, there we go. Patients. I always get ahead of myself. Patients play the role on a front stage. Okay. So I just included a couple of pictures here just to illustrate some of the things that Goffman is talking about. So on the left, these are scenes, first of all, from the film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So I think on the left you see here an illustration of the idea that the mental hospital is a sensible social world. You have, these guys are kidding around with each other. They have friendship relationships with each other. They are a group. And on the right, we have a little depiction. That's Jack Nicholson, the actor, and a depiction of electroshock therapy and what it was like, and have it here as a punishment, a negative sanction, disguised as a therapy. And so this is all part of the context of socialization within this particular total institution for hospital staff. So then finally we get into the book Stigma by Irving Goffman. Notes on the management of spoiled identity. So we talked about that a little bit. Got a couple of quotes from Goffman here where he says stigma is a process by which the reaction of others spoils normal identity. And then we have another quote from him. The normal and the stigmatized are not persons, but perspectives, right? So the normal, what is normal and what is stigmatized are not persons, but they are perceptions, might even be a better word, okay? So we're going to continue talking about stigma. Okay, so then we start with the question of what is a stigma? What do we mean by that? Well, we got, from the title, as I said before, we already have an idea what he means by a stigma. It's a kind of a spoiled identity. It's an undesired identity. It's a way that we do not want to be identified. The book is about how, first of all, different kinds of stigma, and then how people manage the impressions they give off to deflect attention away from whatever characteristic it is that they perceive as potentially stigmatizing. So we have, the idea that, as I said, it's a spoiled identity, it's undesired differentness, it's a discrediting attribute, whatever that attribute may be. And we have a full definition of what we mean by stigma. So these are Goffman's words here. So when he gives us, in the beginning of the book, when he defines what a stigma is, he says, the term stigma will be used to refer to an attribute that is deeply discrediting. But then he says this, right? He says it should be seen, right, that a language of relationships and not attributes is really needed. So this last, I didn't make a really good line there, but this part of the definition needs a little bit of explanation. So what's a stigma? Well, he says it's word we're going to use to describe an attribute that is deeply discrediting, but he says it should be seen that a language of relationships and not attributes is really needed. So what he means there is he's really talking about something we call the relativity of deviance. And what the relativity of deviance means is that there is no such thing as a characteristic or an attribute that any person has that is by itself inherently and automatically stigmatizing. That something is stigmatizing because it is defined. Somebody defines it that way. So it depends on the context. How often do we say that, right, when we talk about this stuff? It depends on the context in which the attribute is being defined. In one context, the attribute may be a stigma, but in another context, the attribute might be a badge of honor. It all depends on the context. It all depends on who is doing the defining. Okay. Maybe you can imagine, right, that in one context, being a criminal would be stigmatizing, that there were those who would look down on that. But in another context, being a criminal, maybe even having a reputation as an ex-con, might actually be something that people are proud of, or people find as a desirable part of their reputation, right? Whatever the setting is, whatever the context is. So Goffman illustrates this idea of relativity of deviance, and this is something that we want to bear in mind for when we get to chapter 6. We're going to come back to this whole idea of the relativity of deviance. We're going to talk about something called labeling theory. Labeling theory is the symbolic interactionist or one of the symbolic interactionist ways of understanding crime and deviance. And so we get back to the notion of the relativity of deviance. Labeling, though, is well, here, let me put it this way. When Goffman is talking about stigma, he talks about things that are undesired, right? Undesired difference, undesired differentness, negative definitions of people. People don't want to be defined negatively. But people can be labeled in different ways, right? So labeling theory would talk about how people might acquire deviant labels, right, which might be undesirable. But we could be labeled in other ways too. I could be labeled as a genius, right? And that's a positive label, and that might be something that I would encourage people to define me as. So anyway, we're talking now. For now, we're talking about stigma. The only point I'm trying to make is that there is something consistent about what Goffman is saying here about stigma and what we're going to be talking about later on when we get to labeling theory. So he's trying to illustrate this notion of the relativity of deviance. And he gives this example. He says, a middle-class boy may feel no compunction, right? In other words, that middle-class boy may feel no hesitation about being seen going into the library, right? A middle-class boy may feel no compunction in being seen going to the library. A professional criminal, however, writes, and then he gives you this quote, right, from this professional criminal. And the professional criminal says, I can remember before now on more than one occasion, for instance, going into a public library near where I was living and looking over my shoulder a couple times before I actually went in, just to make sure no one who knew me was standing about and seeing me do it. So the question would become, well, why would this professional criminal be hesitant of having others see him going into a library? Well, because in his world, in his criminal world, you know, the idea that he's intellectually curious or, you know, sensitive in certain ways, you know, what do you like to read? You know, that kind of thing might threaten his reputation as a criminal, as a tough guy, maybe. And so when he goes into the library, doesn't want people seeing him do it. Okay, he's almost talking like he's like going into the library. He's almost talking about that in the same way that somebody else might describe going into a porn theater, right? I didn't want anybody to see me going into the porn theater, for crying out loud, right? And this all has to do with the relativity of deviance. In one setting, a behavior is completely acceptable. In another setting, it now becomes deviant, or it becomes undesired, or discrediting to my reputation, or whatever. Okay, so here, let's move on then. So now he talks about different types of stigma. So he's going to identify 3 different types of stigma. I'm going to put them all up here, and then we're going to go back and talk about each one. So he's got 3 different types of stigma. One he calls abominations of the body. Another one he calls blemishes of individual character. And the third one he calls tribal. Okay, so we got tribal stigma, we have blemishes of individual character, and we have abominations of the body. So we'll take it from the top here, all right? Now, he describes abominations of the body in his book as the various physical deformities. So these things can be, you know, deformities, so-called deformities of the body that people are born with, or it could be deformities of the body that they acquire. This is what he had primarily in mind, right? There's a great film that I wanted to show you that I'm not going to be able to show you, but a film called Murder Ball, which is about paraplegic men who play a sport called wheelchair rugby, And these are guys who went from being healthy, essentially healthy young men, right, to all of a sudden becoming paraplegics. And it's a very sudden transition for them. And one of the things they talk about in the film is how they do not want to be seen, right, through their deformity, right, through their condition. Right? They want to be seen as still as men, right? They don't want to be seen as victims or as helpless. Now, the way I think about abominations of the body is simply this, right? Is that he's talking about people who possess bodies that fall outside the norm, right? That fall outside the cultural norm of what a normal body is or what a normal body should do. So, this could involve what people look like. This could involve things that have to do with body shape and so on, right? That they simply possess bodies that fall outside the norm of what a normal body is or should do, and that's what he's calling abominations of the body. Now he behind here. So they all have to do with maintaining an integrity of body image. How do people imagine how do people imagine their bodies appear to others, okay, and how those bodies are imagined to be defined. So integrity of body image is important here. The next thing we get to are blemishes of individual character. Okay, and again, this is a quote from Goffman, and he says that blemishes of individual character are characteristics, right, that are perceived as weak-willed, domineering, or unnatural passions, treacherous and rigid beliefs, and dishonesty, these being inferred from a known record of, for example, mental disorder, imprisonment, addiction, alcoholism, homosexuality, unemployment, suicidal attempts, and radical political behavior. That's a mouthful. But basically, all these blemishes of individual character have to do with reputation, right? Reputation. What in my past, what in my reputation do I want to keep secret? That I would rather not have you know about. I hope you follow that, right? If you were going for a job interview, if a person were going for a job interview, they would not want to reveal to the interviewer that they, are alcoholics or that they are recovering addicts or anything like that. Okay, so these are not outwardly visible things. These are things that have to do with reputation. And then finally, he talks about tribal stigma. Okay, so he describes tribal stigma as race, nation, and religion. So people, in other words, seen as belonging to categories of folks that are maybe devalued in society, or against which there is prejudice or discrimination or something like that. Now, I would think, well, here, let me talk about this guy first, okay, this picture here. This guy here is a guy named Yusef. Right? His friends call him Big Joe. Now, this is a picture of him. He's got a hat on with an F on it, and that F stands for Fordson. I was going to show you a movie called Fordson, which is about a football program in Dearborn, Michigan. And I don't know what you know about Dearborn, but Dearborn, Michigan is that area of the country is a place where you could find the most people of Arab descent, the most people of Muslim religion, anywhere in the world, anywhere in the country anyway, outside of the Middle East. So it's a very, very large Arabic Muslim population living in Dearborn. And consequently, for a lot of the public schools, a lot of their students are Arab, are Arabic descent, are Muslim. Fordson High School is one of those places. Something on the order of 70% or 75% of their students are Arabic and Muslim. And the film is about the football program there. But what it's really about, what that film is really about, is what it's like to be Arab American in the post 9/11 world. So you might imagine, right, that these people, since 9/11 happened, are the targets of prejudice, and it's how they deal with it, right? How they live with it, how they go out of their way, right, to show themselves as good Americans. And I have Big Joe here because there's a part in that film where Big Joe is talking about his son and his son's child. In other words, Big Joe's grandson. And they were talking about, well, what are we going to name the baby? And they wanted to name the baby after Big Joe, after Yusef. But they decided that instead of naming the baby Yusef, they would name the baby Joseph. In other words, give him a name that wasn't Arabic. And the way Big Joe puts it was, and he's a little bit disappointed, you could tell. He puts it like this. He says, they gave him that name to make his life easier so he wouldn't have to go through life with an Arabic name and therefore be the target, right, of resentment, essentially. So that's what Goffman meant, right, by tribal stigma. Now, I think I would also put in there the issue of class. Okay, class can also be tribal stigma. So you have another article that you have to read called "Making It by Faking It." That's another one that I have to get you. I'm going to get you a link to it. Making It by Faking It. So Making It by Faking It is an article about a group of there are students whose background is working class, and they are going to a very elite Ivy League law school. And what they find out when they get there is that their working class background is not it's not really valued. Their working class experience is not really valued. The Ivy League schools are elite places, and there are people who are going there and they come from upper middle class to upper class backgrounds, right? And they also learn really quickly through their interactions with their fellow students and through their interactions with their professors that, characteristics that they have that are, outcomes of their working class upbringing might cause others to see them as not cut out for law school. And there are different ways that they can deal with this. There are different ways that they then try to manage this thing, right? Working class background that's potentially stigmatizing for them. One of the things they do is what Granfield calls they fake it. They're faking it. So they try to change the way they speak. They try to change the way they dress, right? They try to avoid certain topics of conversation. Like especially conversations about what their parents do for a living. So all of this is ways that they are managing impressions to try to fit in, to try to act in ways that are more consistent with what's valued by people in the middle class or people in the upper class. So that's Goffman on different types of stigma. He also talks about, I'm going to get this example from him that I'm going to read. this actually probably is more in line with blemishes of individual character here, but he gives and remember, he did all this work in a mental hospital, right? So he says, ex-mental patients, for example, are sometimes afraid to engage in sharp interchanges with a spouse or employer because of what a show of emotion might be taken as a sign of. So here he's talking about how people who have in their reputation the fact that they were mental patients at one time, trying to control their emotions, trying to control emotional outbursts, which, by the way, are very normal, right, to people. You know, people go off, they blow up sometimes. But if I knew that a person had been a mental patient, if I knew that a person had suffered with a mental illness and they have an emotional outburst, how am I likely to define that? Am I going to, define that as a normal behavior, or am I going to say something like, well, they must be off their meds or something, right? So these former mental patients try to be very careful about the way they express emotions in order to avoid being stigmatized, in order to avoid being defined as mental patients or people who have mental disorders. Okay, so there's Goffman on stigma. Okay, so now let's conclude. All right, so Henslin ends the chapter with this notion of the social construction of reality. In fact, he ends it. He talks about two different things. He talks about something called ethnomethodology, and he talks about the social construction of reality. Now, I don't want you to get too hung up on ethnomethodology. It's a big word. It's a big, scary sounding word, right? But ethnomethodology is just another version of symbolic interactionism. And if you understand that, then you understand ethnomethodology a lot, okay? Ethnomethodology is a school of symbolic interactionism that's interested in how people act toward the world through the way they define it. Okay, so that's consistent with this thing that Henslin calls the Thomas theorem. The Thomas theorem comes from a sociologist named W.I. Thomas and his wife, Dorothy Thomas. W.I. Thomas was a Chicago school sociologist, and he said if people define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. So let's just look at that for a second. If people define situations as real, so definition of the situation, they are real in their consequences. So we all act on the world according to how it is defined. Those definitions can vary. They can change according to experience and so on. But a really important idea here is that if we act on the world according to our definitions of it, right, then an important concept is the concept of background assumptions, right? So every setting that we're in has its background assumptions. So the way that Henslin defined background assumptions is he said that these are deeply embedded common understandings of how the world operates and of how people ought to act, right, in those settings. And this is all part of the social construction of reality, the process where we are always creating, right, through our actions and through the way we interact with each other, a reality that we share. The background assumptions, to the extent that we both buy into the same background assumptions, then we share a reality, okay? And we experience that reality as objectively real, as, in other words, as factual, and that it has meaning. And Henslin gives us an example, right? He talks about the gynecological examination, right, as a setting. And there are background assumptions, right, behind this setting. In other words, a gynecological examination is a situation, right, that involves like intimate touching, you know. And so somehow the medical profession has to define it as a non-sexual confrontation, right, as a non-sexual situation. So they're defining it not as sexual, that touching no longer becomes sexual, it becomes clinical. And patients and doctors buy into those background assumptions. And so one of the things he wants to tell us about is how those background assumptions are maintained by both patients and by doctors. Okay, so where are we here? Okay, y'all. That's it for me. That's it for chapter 4. We're going to be moving on. I think chapter 5 is going to be a chapter that I'm going to kind of leave to you. I will give you a study guide for that. I might talk you through a little bit of that. I don't think it'll be as extensive as what I just did. I think we want to, as soon as we can, get to the chapter on crime and deviance. And I think there'll be a certain amount of continuity between what we just did and chapter 6 on crime and deviance. So stay safe. I guess the good thing is that all the bars are closed, you know, and probably not much else to do except sociology. At least that's what I would like to think. And let's all get through this together. Wash your hands. Okay, wash your hands. Wash your hands all the time, every time. Get obsessive. Get obsessive compulsive about washing your hands. Okay. Meanwhile, take care of yourself. And I miss you. I miss you all. You know, this sucks. I mean, I don't know how you felt about coming to class, but I would much rather be doing this in front of people that, in front of actual people, you know, instead of talking to myself in my frickin' office. All right. So, Godspeed.